I had stayed at Ryan's house many times before, but something about this particular weekend felt different from the start. Maybe it was because we hadn't seen each other in months, and I had missed him more than I'd admit out loud. Or maybe it was just the familiarity of being in his home again, walking through that same front door, greeted by his mom's warm smile and the smell of dinner already cooking. Whatever it was, there was a current in the air, something unspoken, something I couldn't quite place yet. Ryan was the same as always, energetic, chatty, tugging at my arm as he led me upstairs to drop my bag in his room. His laughter filled every corner of the house, and with him, it always felt like I belonged. We had been friends for so long that his family treated me like one of their own. I knew where the extra towels were kept, I knew which cupboard had the snacks, and I knew how Ryan always kicked his shoes into the same corner by the door. But there was one part of this house that never quite felt familiar: his older brother, Ethan. The first time I saw him that evening, he was leaning against the doorway of the kitchen, a glass of water in his hand, watching quietly as Ryan and I joked around about some old memory. Ethan was taller than Ryan, broader in the shoulders, and carried himself with a kind of calm that made me instantly self-conscious. He wasn't unfriendly, but he wasn't overly warm either. He gave me a small nod, his eyes lingering on me just a moment longer than I expected, before turning back to whatever he had been doing. We all sat down to dinner together, Ryan filling every silence with his stories and his parents chiming in here and there. Ethan didn't say much, but when he did, it was direct, his voice lower, steadier. Every so often I'd catch his eyes on me, and each time it sent a strange little ripple through my chest. I reminded myself not to think too much about it. It was just Ethan, Ryan's brother. Later that night, Ryan suggested we watch a movie in his room like old times. We piled onto his bed, a bowl of popcorn between us, and for the first hour it felt like nothing had changed. By the time the credits rolled, though, Ryan was half asleep, mumbling something about how tired he was before turning over and dozing off completely. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling in the dim light, unable to fall asleep myself. The house had gone quiet, except for the occasional creak of wood as it settled. Eventually, I slid out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake Ryan, and wandered toward the kitchen for some water. The hallway was dim, lit only by a small lamp near the stairs, and as I walked, I suddenly noticed Ethan coming from the opposite direction. He was in a plain t-shirt and sweatpants, hair slightly messy, like he'd just gotten ready for bed himself. We stopped when we met in the middle of the hallway, both a little surprised to see the other still awake. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Yeah," I admitted, holding up the empty glass in my hand. "Thought some water might help." He gave a small smile, not unkind, and for a moment, it felt like the silence between us was heavier than it should have been. His eyes lingered on me again, just like they had at dinner, and this time I felt it more sharply, like a spark I couldn't ignore. We passed each other, and as I walked by, his shoulder brushed lightly against mine. It wasn't much, just the smallest contact, but it made my pulse quicken. I tried to shake it off, filling my glass at the sink while he moved into the living room, flipping idly through something on the coffee table. When I turned back, he was looking at me again, and for a second, neither of us said anything. There was nothing outwardly inappropriate. He hadn't touched me, hadn't said a single suggestive word, but there was something in the way he held his gaze, something in the way my chest tightened under it. I finally broke eye contact, muttering a quick goodnight, and made my way back toward Ryan's room. My best friend was still sprawled across the bed, breathing evenly, completely unaware of what had just passed between his brother and me in that quiet hallway. I slipped under the blanket again, staring into the darkness, trying to convince myself that it had been nothing. Just a look. Just a moment. But deep down, I knew I wouldn't forget it anytime soon. The next morning, sunlight pushed through the blinds and dragged me out of a restless sleep. Ryan was still snoring softly beside me, curled into his blanket the way he always did. For a moment, everything felt normal again, like the strange tension from last night had only been a dream. But when I walked downstairs and saw Ethan already in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a mug of coffee in his hand, that familiar ripple of unease and something else came rushing back. "Morning," he said simply, eyes lifting to meet mine. "Morning," I replied, keeping my voice steady. Though my throat felt tight, Ryan's mom bustled in and out, busy with breakfast. She greeted me warmly, asked how I'd slept, and before I could really answer, Ryan himself stumbled in, rubbing his eyes and complaining about how late he'd stayed up. His energy filled the room again, making me feel safer, anchored. Yet every time I risked glancing at Ethan, he was already watching me, calmly, silently, like he was waiting for something. After breakfast, Ryan announced he was meeting a couple of friends in town for the afternoon. He invited me along, but I shook my head, telling him I was tired and wanted to just hang back at the house. The truth was, I wasn't sure if I wanted the distraction or if I was afraid of being alone in the house with Ethan. Still, I stayed. Ryan left, and suddenly, the house felt bigger, emptier. I ended up in the living room, scrolling absently on my phone, trying to act like it didn't matter. Ethan walked in not long after, a book in his hand, and sat down on the opposite end of the couch. He didn't say anything at first, just opened the book and began to read. But the silence wasn't simple silence. I felt it thick in the air between us. Every time he shifted, every time I caught the faint sound of him turning a page, my awareness of him sharpened. Eventually, he spoke without looking up. "You and Ryan are close. Always have been." "Yeah," I said carefully. "He's like family." That made him glance up, and his eyes lingered a beat too long. "Family," he repeated quietly, as though testing the word. I looked down at my phone, pretending to be absorbed, but I could feel the way his attention pressed against me. It was different from Ryan's easy energy. Ethan's presence felt heavier, more deliberate. He asked me a few more questions about school, about work, about how often I visited. His tone wasn't casual the way Ryan's would have been. It was more probing, steady, like he was peeling back layers I hadn't meant to show. And the longer it went on, the more unsettled I felt, though not in a way that made me want to leave. At one point, he leaned forward to place his book on the table, and the distance between us shrank. His knee brushed mine briefly, and neither of us moved away. My heart thudded hard, and I reminded myself of where I was, who I was with, and what crossing that line would mean. But it was getting harder to ignore the gravity pulling me toward him. By the time Ryan returned, the spell had broken, and Ethan had disappeared upstairs without a word. Ryan was oblivious, launching into stories of his afternoon, making me laugh, making me forget, at least temporarily. That evening we ate dinner together again, Ryan chatting through most of it while Ethan remained his quiet self. But under the surface, the tension was louder now, humming through every accidental glance, every stolen second. Later that night, Ryan invited me to sleep in his room again, and I agreed. He put on another movie, but within minutes his breathing had slowed, and he was gone, out like a light. I tried to focus on the screen, but my thoughts were tangled, replaying every subtle glance, every brush of contact with Ethan. After a while, my mouth felt dry, and I slipped quietly out of the room, heading toward the kitchen. The house was dark, the air cooler than before, and as I stepped into the kitchen, I froze. Ethan was there again, leaning against the counter with a glass in his hand, as though he had been waiting. "Water?" he asked, his voice low, calm. "Yeah," I said. Throat tight, he poured me a glass, and when he handed it to me, his fingers brushed mine, lingering just enough to make the air catch in my chest. "You know," he said slowly, "I noticed you the second you walked in yesterday." The words sent a rush of heat through me. I didn't know what to say, so I took a sip of water, eyes fixed on the floor. "Ryan doesn't see things the way I do," he continued, almost to himself. "But I see you." I set the glass down, heart racing, trying to form words that wouldn't come. The silence stretched, filled with everything I was too afraid to say. For a moment it felt like something irreversible was about to happen. His hand shifted slightly like he was about to reach for me, and I stepped back, shaking my head. "I should go back to bed," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan didn't move closer, but his eyes held mine in a way that made me feel exposed, like he already knew every thought I was trying to deny. Finally, I forced myself to leave, retreating back to Ryan's room. I climbed into bed beside him, guilt heavy in my chest. He stirred briefly, unaware, and went right back to sleep. I lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the look in Ethan's eyes and the words that still echoed in my head. Sleep never came easy that night. I tossed and turned beside Ryan, my mind a storm of conflict I couldn't quiet. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan in the kitchen, the way he had looked at me, the weight of his words. I heard him say he noticed me, that he saw me, and no matter how I tried to push it aside, it kept returning, stirring something inside me that felt both thrilling and dangerous. Ryan shifted in his sleep, mumbling incoherently before rolling over. His presence should have anchored me, reminded me why I shouldn't let my thoughts wander. But instead, the contrast tore me apart. Ryan was my best friend, the one person who trusted me enough to open his home, his family, his life. And yet here I was, lying awake because of the quiet pull of his brother's attention. At some point, the creak of the floorboards outside the room pulled me from my haze. I froze, listening. A faint shadow slipped past the doorframe. My pulse quickened instantly. I told myself it was nothing. Just Ethan moving through the house like before, maybe heading to the kitchen again. But then, the doorknob turned slightly, and the door opened a fraction wider. Ethan stepped in, silent, calm, his face unreadable in the faint glow from the hallway light. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me. Ryan stirred but didn't wake. I sat up slowly, whispering, "What are you doing?" His voice was low, deliberate. I couldn't sleep either. I should have told him to leave, should have pushed him away, but the words caught in my throat. Ethan stepped closer, his gaze locked on mine, and my chest tightened in a mix of fear and anticipation. He stopped at the edge of the bed, looking down at me like he was daring me to stop him. "Ethan," I whispered, glancing toward Ryan, panic and desire colliding. "I know," he said softly, his eyes flicking briefly toward his brother before returning to me. "I shouldn't be here." He paused, his jaw tightening. "But you feel it too, don't you?" I wanted to deny it, but my silence betrayed me. The air between us felt charged, so thick it was hard to breathe. He crouched slightly, bringing his face closer, and my entire body trembled. I thought of Ryan, of the years of trust and friendship, of how easily this could shatter everything. And yet, when Ethan's hand brushed against mine, I didn't pull away. The smallest touch unraveled me. I felt my resolve slipping as he lingered there, his fingers tracing against mine with a kind of patience that made it impossible to pretend I didn't want it. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out every rational thought. He leaned closer, his breath warm against my skin. "Tell me to go," he whispered. But I didn't. I couldn't. What happened next blurred into a mix of urgency and quiet desperation. The room was silent except for our breaths, and all the while Ryan lay only inches away, oblivious. The thrill of it, the danger, the sheer wrongness of the moment only made it more consuming. Every movement felt like a betrayal and a release all at once. I knew I should stop, but Ethan's presence was overwhelming, pulling me deeper into something I hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. There was no gentleness in the tension that bound us together. It was raw, unspoken, inevitable. At one point, I caught Ryan shifting again in his sleep, and terror jolted through me. I froze, my entire body seizing with guilt. Ethan stilled too, his eyes locked on mine, and for a second, it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. When Ryan settled again, turning over without waking, Ethan exhaled, a quiet, controlled sound that seemed to acknowledge the insanity of what we were doing. Still, neither of us stopped. When it finally ended, I lay back against the pillow, my chest rising and falling rapidly. Ethan stood, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, satisfaction, regret, maybe both. He didn't say a word as he slipped back out of the room, leaving me in the suffocating silence. Beside me, Ryan murmured in his sleep, completely unaware of the storm that had just torn through his brother and his best friend. I turned to look at him, and guilt sank deep into my bones. My heart ached, torn between what I had always known, loyalty, friendship, love, and this new secret, this reckless connection that could never be undone. I lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling as the first traces of light crept into the room. My body was heavy with exhaustion, but my mind refused to rest. What had happened wasn't something I could erase. It was seared into me now, a dangerous memory that would follow me long after I left this house. When morning came, Ryan woke cheerfully, stretching and yawning, completely oblivious. He nudged me, asking if I wanted to grab breakfast with him. I forced a smile, nodding, while inside my chest, everything felt fractured. As I followed him out of the room, I caught sight of Ethan at the bottom of the stairs. He looked up at me, his expression calm, controlled, but his eyes told a different story. They held mine for a fleeting second, and in that glance I knew the line had been crossed, and nothing between us, or between me and Ryan, would ever be the same again.